Yeah, I told someone who wasn't going to be able to make it that I'd record it for him. Oh, here we go. Now back here. By its very meaning, this evasive concealment in the face of death cannot be authentically certain of death, and yet it is certain of it. What are we to say about the certainty of death? To be certain of any entity means to hold it for true as something true. But truth signifies the uncoveredness of some entity, and all uncoveredness is grounded ontologically in the most primordial truth, the disclosedness of Dasein. As an entity which is both disclosed and disclosing, and one which uncovers, Dasein is essentially in the truth. But certainty is grounded in the truth, or belongs to it primordially. The expression certainty, like the term truth, has a double signification. Primordially, truth means the same as being disclosive, as a way in which Dasein behaves. From this comes the derivative signification, the uncoveredness of entity. Correspondingly, certainty in its primordial signification is tantamount to being certain as a kind of being which belongs to Dasein. However, in a derivative signification, any entity of which Dasein can be certain will also get called something certain. So I've got just a general question, like how are people understanding certain and something being certain? I thought I was understanding what he was meaning, but this paragraph in the beginning, the first one that I read of two kinds of certainty, as well as this last sentence, any entity of which Dasein can be certain will also get called something certain. I'm not sure if that's supposed to be negatively inflected, but I feel like certainty is, it's just like some clarity. David and then James.
As in so much of Heidegger, I think it's a somewhat provisional assertion or statement, because the obvious question comes up. One, a certainty may exist, but whether or not it actually lines up with truth in actuality is another question altogether. So that's it for me. I just think it's provisional. More to come here, I think, in terms of what is meant by certainty. So that's it.
Thank you, David. James and then Jerry.
Yeah, I think he's talking about certainty in two respects. One is, in relation to the certainty by the they self. The they self is a kind of certainty of death as an actual event, whereas the certainty for Dasein, for the authentic self, is a certainty as a possibility, certainty as a possibility of death, which can happen anytime, which is indefinite. And I think that's what he means in those two respects, I think.
Okay, Jerry?
Yeah, he's got, I think I sort of agree with David, maybe one proviso. He's got certain and truth in quotes, which implies he's distancing himself in some sense from those terms. He's choosing not to really define it in a sense, certainly not choosing not to define truth. But then, the second paragraph that you highlighted, it says, to be certain of an entity means to hold it for true. So then he tries to give some sort of a definition of certainty, but he defines it in a way that is yet indeterminate, right? To be certain is just something that we hold to be true. Meanwhile, truth is in quotes, and what he means by truth is uncertain. So, I'm just kind of rambling, but yeah, I'm just noting that he's got like a distance between himself and the terms.
Thank you, Jerry. Dan?
Yeah, I think you are right that when you said that Heidegger is taking certainty here kind of negatively. And I think this is it's a reference to Descartes, like Descartes defined something to be true as like the true in terms of certainty. And then Husserl also went along that way. And we should remember there are several definitions of true. One is certainty a la Descartes. Then there is one like object subject, like the correspondence between an object and our representation as again as correspondence. And then there is, for example, in Kant, another definition of true as the conditions for objectivity, like the transcendental categories and so on. And I think what Heidegger is saying here is that actually true is something more fundamental. And I think he's hinting that it's aletheia, like that's what it means by uncoverness. And this is the fundamental true, and all this certainty, correspondence, and what was that, like a la Kant, they are all derivative ways to define true.
Thank you, Dan. Kelsey?
I was thinking about how I think that this is also Heidegger's referencing something here that he was talking about in some earlier chapters. And I think that there's some of his scholarship on Aristotle here, and that is the getting down to the basics of predicates and having the holding something as being a fundamental unit of understanding. And so here he's saying, to hold something as certain is a way that Dasein is, right? It's a mode of behavior that it is. And so it goes in many ways to the fundamentals of how Dasein creates meaning. It holds something as something in the world. It says this is as this. So it's a predicative kind of approach to the world and creating meaning. Now the truthness of it, that I'm a little bit shakier on that, because he's saying that basically Dasein is already in the truth, and therefore to be certain of something is to hold it, is to make it its own, and therefore I guess to bring it into the world of Dasein where that truth is. But you have to take something as true, that is that Dasein brings it into its realm of truth and holds it as true, or holds it as something true. That's kind of where I'm thinking of the Aristotle angle here.
Thank you, Kelsey. Claudio and then Jerry.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, Heidegger is not the easiest philosophers to understand, that's for sure. And any one of the prior comments or interpretations could have been correct as far as I'm concerned. But it appears that he's describing two types of certainties in regards to the truth. One is the traditional method, which he apparently rejects, which is this, truth through, let's say, the Cartesian method or empiricism, right? Trying to find the essence of things. He prefers, actually, like the previous said, he says Dasein is already in the truth, so it's not necessary to dig deeper to find an additional or a deeper meaning to anything, objects or anything else. See, for him, it's like the uncovering, the disclosure of something. It's like a discovery, right, for him. It's like it's ready at hand or in the presence. It's totally different from the traditional method. See, it's primordial in that sense. Yeah, like I said, he's not the easiest philosophers to understand. It can become mind-boggling. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudio. Jerry and then Brent.
Incorporating the last two comments, I'm going to change what I said about the quotation marks. I don't think it's necessarily that he's trying to distance himself from the terms anymore. I think he's not trying to give some sort of definition that's like an absolute definition or authoritative definition. Instead, I think he's looking at the phenomenon of those terms, or how those terms get used in their everyday usage. So in everyday usage, when people talk of being certain, they're talking about something they hold to be true. And so he puts truth in quotes. And what he means by that is, well, what we call truth appears to be this or appears to be that. Or if you look at how people use the word truth in everyday usage, this phenomenon of disclosedness becomes revealed. And so I think that's why he's putting it in quotes, not because, not because he's distancing himself from it, but he's not laying claim to like some absolute definition of the terms. He's just rather looking at what is revealed by the usage of those terms.
Thank you, Jerry. Brent?
Yes, hi. Yeah, I think to some degree he's contrasting his idea of truth, namely as aletheia or uncoveredness, to the correspondence theory of truth. In the correspondence theory of truth, I or anyone has a mental image of an object, and if that mental representation corresponds to the object in the outside world, then there's truth. The problem with the correspondence theory of truth is that in order to know that my idea of the object corresponds to the object in the outside world, I must at some level already know the object. And so what Heidegger, in this contrast, Heidegger is saying that this already knowing the object at some level means that Dasein is always already in the truth.
Okay, so yeah, that's really helpful for me. That understanding that the kind of knowledge is always already there, in a way. I guess the one thing I wanted to highlight with the first paragraph is the authentically certain of death. So it's like those two kinds of certain. Oh yeah, Phil, you want to go? I was about to move it somewhere else. You want to go?
Yeah. Didn't he say somewhere that it's that being is about a commitment to unfolding the potentiality of its being? So therefore, truth is in this dynamic process, to me, seems like it is his commitment to the truthfulness of it in order to commit to the process of unfolding the possibilities that is coming, right? So this is a unfolding a action-oriented truth, not necessarily an identity truth, but something that allows you to be committed to the process of unfolding the possibilities, because that's the more important part, because you are in the world of unfolding.
Thank you, Phil. James?
Yeah, I think it's gonna go back to this idea of the unfolding of truth is kind of aligned with what I was saying about the correspondence theory of truth, where you what you understand and what is actual, they correspond to the outside in the world. And then the other kind of uncoveredness of truth is within the being of Dasein, and that kind of truth is the unfolding, uncoveredness of possibility. And I think that's what he means by equiprimordiality, that these two kinds of truths somehow come into reveal themselves together at the same time. And I think there is a certainty in both of those kinds of truth, the outside actual and the within the possibilities of Dasein, the understanding of Dasein, of these possibilities.
Thank you, James. David, and I'm going to move us to the next thing, Phil. And it's going to follow suit with, I think, what we're talking about.
This is almost more a question than a statement, because I want to be clear about something. When you're talking about the correspondence between whatever image I have inside of me corresponding with an object outside of me, and then that in that correspondence having established truth. It seems to me we had spent the past 300 or 400 years trying to be very, very careful about that structure, if you will, which is the division of the universe and our knowledge of the universe into a duality between the subject and the object. And I'm wondering if there's not a danger that we might, undercut everything that we have thought about that since then, even prior to Kant, or perhaps I'm just misunderstanding what's been said here. But that's it's a concern. It's just a concern. I think I just need a little bit of a clarification. If anybody can jump in there, that would be helpful, or perhaps pick it up later on a side note, whatever.
Yeah, I think to say undercut it, I don't think that Heidegger would disagree with that. I mean, remember, he starts with a very humble. He starts in a very humble place, saying all of philosophy has been wrong in the beginning of the book, saying that we haven't actually looked at what we should have been looking at. So I don't. Kelsey, do you want to say something quickly?
Yeah, just a super quick comment. I always find it helpful to zoom out when I get stuck in a passage like this, and that is remembering that where he's going with this is to outline the role of death in Dasein's existential state of being. And one of its aspects is certainty. And therefore we have to understand certainty in order to really get to his, to the point that he's trying to make. And I was just going to make that kind of zoom out statement if I could.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we'll see that comes up later on is that, this all started with talking about death as being incomplete. And I definitely felt like by the end of section 4 or whatever, or 54 or 53, what was the last section, he was able to answer that question ontologically. But I did want to return to what James and Phil were bringing up about understanding, because I think that's one of the questions I had about authenticity. And I'll just read the quote, and I think it will follow right along with what James is saying. So this is German 259, the second complete paragraph on the Macquarie 303. Our everyday falling, evasion in the face of death is an inauthentic being towards death. But inauthenticity is based on the possibility of authenticity. I don't understand that. Inauthenticity characterizes a kind of being into which Dasein can divert itself and has, for the most part, always diverted itself. But Dasein does not necessarily and constantly have to divert itself into this kind of being. Because Dasein exists, it determines its own character as a kind of entity, as the kind of entity it is. And it does so in every case in terms of a possibility, which it itself is and which it understands. Because I have a very simple question. Maybe I'll read the next question too. Can Dasein also understand authentically its own most possibility, which is non-relational and not to be outstripped, which is certain and such indefinite? The simple question I have about authenticity is it just understanding? Is it like understanding not, I felt like the two distinctions of certainty he was talking about before were inauthentic certainty, like I know death happens, it's going to happen eventually. And then like authentic certainty, which is, death is already here in a way. And I'm just trying to comprehend if authenticity is just some type of understanding in relation to death and being. I know, Brent, you had your hand up early. I don't know if you wanted to comment on this, but.
Yeah, I do.
Okay, go for it.
Okay, so we say in common language, we talk about bats, those creatures that live in caves. And we say bats are blind, but there is a particular place in Heidegger where he said that bats cannot be blind. Only entities which are capable of seeing can be blind. So a bat is not blind because it's not capable of seeing. So there we have, not to be condescending toward people who are blind, but they live in a deprived state where, you know, I basically that inauthenticity can only be understood on the basis of authenticity, not the other way around. You'll never arrive at authenticity if you start with inauthenticity. It's rather the other way around. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Let me go to the other people and then we'll see if I get more clarity on that. I'm going to go to Pamela first. You have to unmute yourself, Pamela.
Hi, I'm struggling with it too, and I'm going to approach it from a very less abstract way. That's all right. You can tell me if that doesn't work. To me, I was just looking at it in a very literal way. I was just thinking about death and how, in order to, just in a concrete way, in order to cope with death, we know death is reality, but we have to distance ourselves from it. So it's constantly there. It's a real thing, but we're not fully aware of what it is. We don't dwell in it, perhaps because it's too painful, it's too real. So we have to have, in general, an inauthentic relationship with it. We have to have, we can't have a fully concrete relationship with it. We have to remove ourselves from it, but we know it happens to other people. We know. So that's just how I was grappling with it.
Thank you, Pamela. Let's go to Phil.
Yeah, this reminds me of going back, I think 2 sessions ago, or is it more? 2 sessions ago, when we talk about that in the sense that Dasein at the end is a debtor because he's always moving into the future. And so he does not, in a sense, actually experience death. He is just dead. And my thought is this, that the authentic life to him is to live and unfold to the future possibilities. But death is always present because it defines the limit of time that Dasein has. So Dasein must, in such an existence, in a sense, you could say cheat, or you could say he's a debtor to death. He borrows from death in order to live. And when it comes to the end, whenever that is, because it's ever present, death, he is demised by death, but he is demised at the point that he is a debtor to death because he has lived in this borrowed actuality, you could say, in which, in a sense, he still owes debt because he's borrowed this potential to push forward. And in a sense, he has kind of cheated death by using the debt he owes to death in order to live and pursue the possibility of what his potential would be.
Thank you, Phil. Let's go to Isabel and then Kelsey.
Yes, looking at it in the long view, I think I can remember who said that. I think that's a good idea. I think I take inauthentic certainty to mean inauthentic certainty is to expect. Authentic certainty is to anticipate. When we go a little forward, you will see the enormous weight he gives to this difference between expect and anticipate. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Kelsey?
Yeah, a couple of us have been having a conversation about authentic and inauthentic understanding on the Slack conversation. And I think some of it's relevant here as well, because it seems that we come to an inauthentic understanding through a process of verbalizing. We create statements, we engage in discourse, we have language, and then the language, by engaging in a conversation about death, we then immediately fall into an understanding of death that it does not belong to us. It's comfortable, it's shared, It's, but we lose that reference point of the self. And I think that to contrast that, I think what he's talking about, he's asking the question, can Dasein also understand authentically its own most possibility? This then is that, by contrast, I'm thinking that this is that wordless or sense of presence in the present, being in the presence of one's own finitude and death as an ongoing part of what we experience, and making that a part of how we exist. That to me is kind of like what he's trying to talk about, understanding authentically. And I only get there by creating this kind of an understanding that I have of what he's talked about understanding, and how that is an unauthentic understanding. Hopefully that's clearly put.
Okay, thank you, Kelsey. James?
Yeah, I think he pretty much lays out there's 4 stages in the ontological meaning of death, and the first one is the threefold disclosure of facticity and fallenness and existentiality, and the second one, the fallenness and the second stage is all about the understanding of what it means to be inauthentic in your relationship to death. And that's like thinking about death in terms of the they. The they means that you see other people die every day. You know that they die every day, but you put it in that category of, well, it's everyone dies someday. Someday everyone dies, but it doesn't include yourself. And it has a tranquilizing effect on your understanding of death. And so he goes through that kind of like inauthentic stage before he finally arrives at the fourth stage, which is what he describes as the authentic relationship with death. And so he has to go through this stage of the everyday, understand what that is, what it means to be inauthentic, before one can understand what it does mean to be authentic.
Thank you, James. Dan?
Yeah, to me, the story is something like this, that first, Dasein and man are not the same. So Dasein is something in us, but it's not identical with us. And Dasein was appropriated by being. So to Heidegger, his entire project here is to get us in touch with being, and we need to do that through Dasein. And to do that, we need to somehow get in touch with the Dasein in us. And there are all these inauthentic ways we stay away from that. And by all the authentic ways, we get in touch with Dasein, and by doing so, we do what we're supposed to do in whatever being is telling us and wants us to do. And one way is to understand. For example, here he's talking about that. So as long as we understand that the proper way, and I guess he give us the way to understand it, then we appropriate our Dasein, and by doing that, we are in touch with being. So, and I guess to go back, so understanding is one way to be authentic, doing the right way, but there are other ways to be authentic beside understanding, and to be in touch with our Dasein and thus with being.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Yeah, thank you. I'm curious the last thing you said. Jerry?
3 quick comments. Bill, Heidegger abandoned the whole outstanding debt thing, in the previous section. He brings it up to point out what Dasein is not, which is not a conglomeration or an accumulation of missing pieces. That would be to make Dasein ready to hand. And he abandons that for this metaphor of ripeness of fruit. I can't remember whether he abandons that metaphor or not. I can't remember. Second 2 comments are regarding what is authenticity. I don't have the answer, but I guess I want to suggest a couple clues. I read a quote of Heidegger somewhere, I cannot remember where, but he said something like, you know, to live authentically, you need to spend time strolling through graveyards. So I don't know, maybe that's a clue. In this paragraph, there's also another clue. In the paragraph that you've cited, Garth, he says, inauthenticity characterizes a kind of being into which Dasein can divert itself. That's interesting because it implies to me somehow that authenticity is the original state and inauthenticity is a diversion, which I find to be interesting. I don't know exactly, you know, how to flesh that out and give a definition of authenticity, but I feel like there's a clue there.
Yeah, and the word can is very curious. It can divert, you know, there's a choice there implicit in that. Let's go to David and then Claudio and Phil. David?
Yeah, I'll try not to go on too long here, as is my want, but yeah, I think what Isabel and had to say about anticipation as distinct from, okay, now I'm gonna forget it, as distinct from expectedness, and then looking forward to see where we go with that, coheres with the comments that Kelsey was making about this question about what is owed, I guess, to individual design or individual self. I'm just reading here, and I'm trying to avoid reading the whole thing, but on this is towards the end of 263, the top of page 308, and I'll just read and then I'll stop. Anticipation allows Dasein to understand that potentiality for being in which its inmost being is an issue must be taken over by Dasein alone. Death does not just belong to one's own Dasein. Death lays claim to it as an individual Dasein. And then a little bit further on, he says, Dasein can be authentically itself only if it makes this possible for itself of its own accord, which strongly suggests to me we've gone from simply thinking about Dasein in terms of its basic structures, if you will, and more in terms of, I guess, a kind of a notion of potentiality. It is Dasein embraces its own responsibility, but its own freedom, if you will, to be authentic in the face of death. And there are a couple of sections here which seem to echo this repeatedly. Is that Dasein, in a way, maybe that Dasein hasn't been done before, is kind of taking charge of its not just its death, but it's also its destiny in a way. So, and yeah, I just want to leave it at that.
Yeah, and just to continue that thought briefly, David, a couple lines later, Dasein is authentically itself only to the extent that it projects itself upon its own most potentiality for being, rather than upon the possibility of the they self. So it's almost like,
yeah, that's critical. Yeah, that's critical.
Yeah, it needs you know, the structure of death to project itself on for authenticity to happen.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Claudio and then Phil and his voluntary. Claudio.
Yeah, it sounds very confusing, but I'm gonna take a shot at it. It's very difficult. Yeah, it seems like he's describing an inauthentic way of experiencing death, which is the relational way, when you're relating to others in the world, because Daijin, a way, it's non-individualistic, because you're part of the others, and so you kind of get when you deal with death, you deal with death indirectly, like kind of second hand, not first hand. So in that way, it seems to be, I don't know if the correct word is artificial or non-authentic, right? However, when the self emerges, right? When individualism arises, when perhaps through anxiety or when you're nearing the end and you become withdrawn. See, it says here non-relational. Dasein, where does it say? It's when Dasein that page, you lost the page, you went, if you have to go back. Death does not, when it's authentic, it's non-relational, right? It's experienced through the self. So I'm guessing that it's when the self emerges, perhaps through anxiety, then you get an authentic feel of death. Authenticity arises, right? Yeah, I'm trying to find the line, but I can't because you moved it around, but it's okay. Don't worry about it. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say. I don't know if it's right or not.
Thank you, Claudio. Phil?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I want to accept the criticism about the debtor concept, okay? But I think the important thing is that Dasein understand there is a limit to existence due to the time, and death in that sense is the thing that brackets that limit. But one does not know when that occurs. But what happens is that in the life of ordinariness, everydayness, then what happened is this fear of death has been covered over by all sorts of things that distance it. So in the sense that it avoids death, but in fact, it's sort of like does not drive it to in something else, but is in fact living a kind of inert life. And I think for Dasein to unfold the potentiality of what he could be, his destiny, his potentiality, in a sense, he understands that death is not something, well, maybe you could be anxious about it. It's really a positive force that drive you, that calls you to the action because your time is limited. And therefore you are moved to live and produce the possibilities that you are destined to do. So in that sense, because you are living in the ever presence of the thing that this could be a termination at any time, then in a sense you're motivated to push forward to the real thing, which is to live with the possibility of unfolding your future. So death, so in a sense, you've already died every moment that you are, in a sense, living, because every moment it reminds you and calls you to act instead of just being passive in the world.
I think that last point you said, Phil, will be very important of being called for later on.
Yeah.
Isabel, and then Jerry. You gotta unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. Yes, Heidegger looks at language as an enormous light to give him understanding of his thinking of what is there, of phenomena. Language does that to him. And I just want to say a couple of words about inauthenticity and infinitive, the verb. Inauthenticity, half of his book is dedicated to inauthentic Dasein. Half. Then he realizes, hey, wait a second. Why? Because inauthenticity is a derivative of the default. The default in Dasein is authenticity, not inauthenticity. The same thing with the verb, the infinitive. The infinitive, that is being eternal, infinite, the default is not that. No, the default is to be finite. And that is so important for us mortals. And death gives us light into that and helps us, as someone else was saying, to live a more authentic life, not because we're morose. Oh my God, I'm gonna die. Oh gosh, when am I gonna die? Oh, no, because it enlivens. Death gives life to our lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Jerry, and then Pamela.
Well, Isabel, I want to thank you for that because at our last meeting, I suggested that Heidegger began with examining everydayness, and that everydayness tended towards an inauthentic way of being. And you know, after hearing some comments from you guys, I started doubting whether I had interpreted that first half of the book correctly. But now, Isabel, you're giving me some confidence that maybe I did interpret it correctly, or somewhat correctly. Essentially, though, it sounds like inauthenticity is just not facing the anxiety of the certainty of our own deaths. Not death in general, because abstractly we all know that everybody dies, but not facing the anxiety of our death. So I think we know what inauthenticity means.
Yeah, it's almost like there are two sets of possibilities that are laid before you, inauthentic ones and authentic ones.
I mean, it begs the question if that is inauthenticity, and if authenticity means facing that anxiety, you know, what does it mean to face that anxiety? That's still an open question.
Yeah. I hope it's not that Walter Mitty movie. Pamela and then David. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Hi, yeah. My understanding actually, is it okay if I refer to something I underlined from the text?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
Okay. Death sign means over there. It's over there. My understanding of what he was saying with death sign is it's sort of a societal constraint that we all have to observe the death sign in order to exist without sort of being excluded. He says, Dasein, this plethora of information seduces us into failing to see the real problem. It does not lead to genuine essential knowledge. What he's saying is this inessential knowledge is a movement actually away from the truth. And that's the space where we mainly do exist. My interpretation is it's out of ignorance, but not necessarily willful ignorance. We have to participate in the society. And if we're constantly drawing attention to death or a more authentic form of death, we all know we're going to die. But if we draw attention to death in a more authentic way, I can't remember the term he used. He didn't use vulgar or tacky, or at least in the translation I read, but that's simply not a space we can dwell. And I'll just say this, someone said that Heidegger said something like, if you want to live a better life or something, you know, look at the graveyard. That really resonated with me in terms of being more authentic, but we're drawn away from the authentic in every moment, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of thinking would lend some clarity to the mystery of Socrates' death, right? Mm-hmm. Why he goes forward with it. David, did you still want to make a comment? I know I saw the hand go down and go back up.
Yeah, I just wanted to be clear about something because I think that Heidegger's making a great deal. This whole business about you know, if you want to know how to live a good life or a real life, then just look at the graveyard. Is actually a Buddhist notion and that I'm familiar with. But it also, I think that what Heidegger has been very, very careful to do is to distinguish between fear and anxiety. And so that we may, or Dasein may flee out of fear, which in the face of death, but what is, as opposed to that, is anxiety, which in fact, paradoxically, is something, holds up the possibility of a liberation from the fear. And anxiety is actually fairly central to achieving, particularly the face of death, or just shit that happens in life, coming closer to being an authentic person. So I think, you know, I think Heidegger made that distinction between the fear of the death as represented in the graveyard and the anxiety that we feel years out before we're close to that perhaps, but aware of it, super conscious, aware of death as being an impending event, as actually being something which may be good in the end. It's a liberating from the way that they anticipates or looks at the world. I just wanted to say that. So.
Thank you, David. Dan?
Yeah, I want to go back to a point. So this is like, like trying to understand that in the way that, like, if we acknowledge that, we live more meaningful lives, or we give our life more meaning. So that's kind of an existentialist reading, like Sartre did that, and Heidegger disagree with that completely. So that's not what I'm saying here. This is not an existentialist text. It's not about, I don't know, we face death and then we have more meaningful lives, or if we acknowledge death, our lives will be more happy. Or Heidegger is not an existentialist or a humanist. And to him, all this is about being in touch with being and doing what being asked for. It's, I don't know, destiny, doing the destiny of being and our destiny and being in touch with being. That's all for Heidegger. So again, it's not about humanism. It's not about existentialism to me. It's something else. And that's it.
Thank you, Dan. So Claudio, and then we're going to move on, actually a few pages before this for some clarity. Claudio?
Yeah, very quickly, because I already spoken. Yeah, I agree with David Godkin. Anxiety, for Heidegger, anxiety is not equal to fear. Like, it's not like, oh, I'm gonna die, I need my meds or my psychedelic drugs. No, it's not like that. Fear is something else. Like you said, it reveals the truth situation. It sheds light on certain things. I guess it makes life more authentic, rather than when you're being in the world, you see death differently. You get different opinions about death, different viewpoints, from the public sphere, and you don't you experience the death of others, not your own. So if it's the death of others, then that means it's not a direct experience. It's not your own. You, like I said, it's secondhand. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so I wanted to take us back actually to 261. I found this paragraph extremely confusing. It's the first paragraph of the German 261, the Macquarie 305. In the first instance, we must characterize being towards death as a being towards a possibility. Indeed, toward a distinctive possibility of Dasein itself. Being towards a possibility, that is to say, towards something possible, may signify being out for something possible, as in concerning ourselves with its actualization. Such possibilities are constantly encountered in the field of what is ready to hand and present at hand, what is attainable, controllable, practicable, and the like. In concernfully being out for something possible, there is a tendency to annihilate the possibility of the possible by making it available to us. But the concernful actualization of equipment, which is ready to hand, as in producing it, getting it ready, readjusting, and so on, is always merely relative, since even that which has been actualized is still characterized in terms of some involvement. Indeed, this is precisely what characterizes being. Even though actualized, it remains as actual, something possible for doing something. It is characterized by an in order to. What our analysis is to make plain is simply how being out for something concernfully comports itself toward the possible. It does so not by the thematical consideration of the possible as possible, and by having regard for its possibility as such, but rather by looking circumspectively away from the possible and looking at that for which it is possible. I don't know if anyone understands this paragraph, but I don't understand at all what's going on here. The one line that really jumped out at me was here in the middle. In concernfully being out for something possible, So that kind of makes me think of like I'm with intention turning towards something. There is a tendency to annihilate the possibility of the possible by making it available to us. Yeah, I don't have any direct questions. I'm just looking to see, is this paragraph, like what's it saying? Is it, you know, this was one that was especially dense and confusing. The other ones I kind of followed along with, but this one I really lost my, yeah, Brent?
Well, just, I think in an everyday sense, an everyday way of being, when we are concerned with things and we want to accomplish goals, and we understand those goals as a possibility for ourselves. Once we accomplish that goal, then it is no longer a possibility for ourselves. So for instance, an acorn has the possibility of becoming an oak tree, but once it becomes an oak tree, once the acorn becomes an oak tree, it is no longer possible for it to become an oak tree. It's already an oak tree. And I think here that what is significant here is Heidegger deals quite a bit with potentiality and actuality in a book called The Activation of Force. And it's a deconstruction of a couple chapters of Aristotle and Aristotle's Metaphysics, and he talks about potentiality and actuality. In common ordinary way of looking at actuality is that if we think of an actual house, it is the house that stands in front of us that's already completed and is ready to be moved into, and it's present at hand. But for Aristotle, and also for the Greeks, the actual house is the building of it. So an actual house is the entire process that goes into building it and is the actual building of it. It's staying within the possibility of the house while at the same time expecting its completion. And, you know, it's sort of like a runner at the beginning of a race, at the starting line, on the blocks, ready, set, and waiting for the gun to go off, anticipating the gun to go off, expecting the gun to go off. And that right there is what for Heidegger, or at least for Aristotle, is actuality. And in there, you know, differently than what we're saying, actually the possible becomes more possible there than at any other time.
Okay, thank you. That helps clarify a few of the parts of that. David?
Yeah, I want to thank Brent for talking a little bit about actualization, because I think that's quite key. It's a kind of a turning point type of concept in this paragraph. I don't know how other people do this, but one of the things that I do is that when I go through Heidegger, I find I'm getting a lot cleaner in terms of no longer messing up everything with ink here, but by looking at the principal clauses in his statements, and then eliminating a lot until I get to the verb, okay, and then the object. I find that just helps me. But it seems to me that the clue here, starts right at the beginning in the sentence where it says, in the first instance, we must characterize being towards death as a being towards a possibility, indeed towards a distinctive quality, a possibility of Dasein itself. So I think implicit here is what I was referring to earlier about the ball is really in the court of Dasein at this point. It's no longer, well, let me just read here. Actualization is always merely relative, since it's still characterized in terms of some involvement, something possible for doing something. And in order to do what our analysis is to make plain is simply how being comports itself towards the possible. So now, once again, the question becomes, what is being doing? How is it comporting itself? And comporting itself towards the possible by looking at that for which it is possible. I think that's kind of the central arc or theme or thread, if you will, for the paragraph, is that, how being comports itself towards the possible, including death, by looking at that for which it is possible. So then we still have an open questionnaire. What does that mean? For which it is possible. But I think for me, that was a way of helping me to understand it. Just trimming a lot of the stuff in between and then just trying to find the thread. So there you go.
Thank you, David. James?
Yeah, I think what he's talking about is that when we studied about Dasein. Dasein as a ready to hand means that we can use the things in the world as tools, and actually that's a kind of involvement that becomes actualized. But he's saying that when it comes to death as a possibility, you don't want to do that. It's not a kind of not the same kind of involvement of actualizing death and using it as a tool, because in the next paragraph you'll see that if you do that, if you actually would do that, that would bring about your own demise, right? And so Dasein's relationship to death is not one of actualization. It is one of a possibility, a anticipation, that is a possibility, a certainty, and but indefinite possibility. And so he's saying that in the next paragraph, he says, the manifestly being towards death, which is now in question, cannot have the character of concernfully being out to get itself actualized. For one thing, death as a possible is not something possible, which is ready to hand or at present hand, but a possibility of Dasein's being. So to concern oneself with actualizing what is thus possible would have to signify bringing about one's demise, right? But if this is done, Dasein would deprive itself of the very ground for existing being towards death. So it's the difference between using death as a tool, as Dasein usually does in relation to the world, and as a possibility, which is different.
Right, I think so.
Thank you. That was clarifying for the present hand, ready to hand portion for that. Thank you, appreciate it. Phil.
I cannot answer this question in regard to death and the possibilities it unfolds, but I could sort of say something about possibility and anxiety in terms of creating art. I know when I create a work of art, what I want to do is to find the potentiality rubbing against the impossibility. And that's the moment that when you know it has reached its limit, whatever it is. And in the meantime, because you do not know where that boundary is, you are always kind of anxious about the capability of the possibilities to actualize itself. What happens is at some point, if it turns out to be, well, let me say something about when something doesn't happen, is that you never find where that boundary is, and you end up with a work of art. That's okay, that's pretty good, but it's not what you think it could have been. But okay, you're gonna settle for that. But what happened when it's a good work of art, what happens at some point is the process itself takes over and you are working within it and you are being part of it. And in some sense, you are able then, in a sense, to shoot beyond the thing. And actually the anxiety actually goes away because you're with it. The process is within you and you're within the process. So I kind of think that the anxiety is us being uncertain of who we are, and we want to unfold it to the fullest potential, but there does have a limit of what the possibilities are. And what I'm interested in as an artist is to find out what that boundary is between my potentiality to actualize that and the impossibility of what it is. And sometimes you don't even come close because you never even get there because the process just doesn't work.
Thank you, Phil. Isabel?
Yes, thank you. Unfortunately, my brain is not big enough to remember what everybody said and also think of what I'm going to say at the same time. So if I step on toes, forgive me. Well, I think just to the sentence that you read about possibility and the fact about it actualizing in some way, if we already know where it's heading, I think what he is adverse to is that we take away the awe, we take away the mystery. We must linger with the mystery, stay with the mystery, not immediately grasp and find endings and solutions and what's it for? No, there is merit to stay and linger. It's called bleib, B-L-E-I-B, to linger, to stand with the mystery. There's merit to that. And as far as Jean-Paul Sartre, just to be a little bit infantile in kindergarten, Heidegger thought Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism was poo-poo. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Nick, go for it. Don't forget.
Oh, there, sorry, I forgot to. Yes, just to focus on this paragraph that you put our attention to, Garth, in parsing it. I think a lot of statements were made about death and so forth, but in this particular paragraph, the way I understand it is being towards death as a being towards a possibility. But what does it mean to have a being towards a possibility? Not necessarily being towards death now, just the idea of being towards a possibility. He's saying, but one of the things about this is being out for something possible. There's a tendency to annihilate the possibility of the possible by making it available to us. So that possibility becomes annihilated when we actually actualize it, when it happens. But the important statement, though, is this statement that he says, but even though actualized, it remains as actual, something possible for doing something. It is characterized by an in order to. So even when you've actualized, there's still that possibility because you've done something and accomplished something in order to do something else. So in that, there's another step. There's still an openness, another possibility of the in order to. So what he's saying at the very end is, the last statement, what our analysis is to make plain is simply how being out for something concernfully in order to comports itself towards the possible. It does so not by theoretical, thematical consideration of the possible as possible, and by having regard for its possibility as such, but rather by looking circumspectively away from the possible and looking at that for which it is possible. And now looking at that for which it is possible is the in order to. So we kind of have that tendency, even when actualized, to look at what did we do this for? What is it in order to? And that has a relationship with the ready to hands and all that sort of thing. I think this is the only thing that he's saying in this particular, this is the way to parse it correctly, I believe. After that, he talks about how this is really not the way the possibility for death, because we don't want to actualize, as James pointed out. But in this particular paragraph, it is just pointing out what it means to be being towards a possibility.
Thank you, Nick. I'm going to go to Geneva and Jerry, and I'm going to move us to anticipation so that we have a chance to discuss that before we go. Geneva?
This is a dense paragraph. I agree, but I was noticing, and maybe this is just semantics, but he seems to distinguish between being towards a particular thing and being out for a particular thing. And I'm wondering if that distinction is trying to get across getting to the possibility or not getting to the possibility, or why is that distinction there? Because he makes it multiple times. He starts by saying being towards death as a being towards a possibility. But then he goes on to saying being out for something possible, as in concerning ourselves with its actualization. So I'm not quite sure what the distinction is, but it seems like he's trying to say one is doing it and one is attempting to do it, maybe. And then somebody mentioned Sartre, and he does talk about annihilate here, which is a term that Sartre uses a lot, which I still haven't figured out yet, but that annihilate the possibility of the possible by making it available. And that was one where he used being out for something possible. So I don't know if any of that means anything or not, but it kind of stood out to me. And I was just wondering if anyone else had any thoughts about that.
Well, let's see what Jerry has to say.
Thanks.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm gonna be able to help you out with that one. But obviously, yeah, these two paragraphs are talking about two different kinds of possibility. You know, it's so one way of possibility is, well, what is going to make it possible for me to finish this book being in time? Hey, if I do a reading plan, I read this many pages every day, then I'll achieve that possibility. But that's not really the kind of possibility he's concerned with. He's talking about possibility with a capital P, the possibility of possibility, or the conditions of possibility. What makes my own possibility significant for Heidegger is that I might die soon. I might die tomorrow. So there's two ways in which my not finishing this book might not be realized. One is I don't follow, the reading plan that I planned out. That's one kind of impossibility. But Heidegger is more concerned with the other kind, which is death, which is certain but indeterminate, could come at any time. And that's a different kind of impossibility. He's concerned with that. And he's also concerned with not just, general impossibility. All of us are generally faced with that. We all generally abstract know that we're all going to die. He's talking about our own distinct possibilities. And so then when I contemplate that, well, what does that mean, our own distinct possibilities? What is my own distinct potential? When I think about those things, there's this temptation to leap into these moralistic cliches like, well, because I might die any time, therefore, carpe diem, seize the day, go off and go take that trip to Tahiti that I always planned, or fill my bucket list, or, go find a Himalayan retreat, start meditating. But I think Isabel answered this question for me, is that it isn't about following some sort of formula. Once I face my anxiety, then I'll realize that, hey, I need to just go out and seize the day and smell the roses and whatever. It's I need to face my anxiety, full stop. I need to linger there. He's not offering a formulaic prescription for life, because to do so would be inauthentic. Rather, if there is anything prescriptive, it is just to kind of linger with that anxiety, and each of us will respond to that in our own distinct, unique ways.
Yeah, I wonder, because you brought up conditions for possibility, Jerry. I wonder if almost, and this is a stray thought, so I don't know if it's going to connect, but that the idea is that the annihilation of possibility would kind of be like if I follow the they self into something, and that like there are a certain regimen of possibilities that I have at my disposal, and I wonder if the big possibility that he wants to get at is like the exact opposite of a carpe diem type of thing, where it's like, I live in the possible. I don't even know what the hell that means, but that in some type of ontological turning, like that's just where I am. I really don't know what that would look like in reality, but I think at least theoretically, it's something like there's no possibility to annihilate the possible because I don't know. I don't know. Apparently that stirred other thoughts. So I guess we're going to stay with this for a little bit longer. Phil, and then Pamela and David. Phil?
Yeah, Isabel introduced a word that's very important. That's a mystery. Because it seems to me for Heidegger, is the most important thing is to be fascinated in the engagement with the unfolding of possibilities, because the unfolding is always, I think, simultaneously also covering over as well. I think that process is the most important thing, because what you do is you remain engaged in the process rather than objectifying into an actuality of the object. I think that's important because I think that mystery, I think of it as kind of like the dance of the seven veils. I mean, it's never complete. And the incompleteness of it puts you engaged with the world, engaged with the process. And I think when you put a period on it, like then it's like you're disengaged. I think that is actually in some ways the most fundamental thing about truth, is to continue to be fascinated by the uncovering of what things could be. Not only yourself, but the process and the world itself, because you are in some ways, I don't want to quite go so far as one with the world, but you are certainly engaged with the world. So that's all I got to say. Thank you, Isabel.
I think it was Pamela then David. Pamela?
Yeah, I'm curious what his relationship with spirituality was. I don't recall if he was Christian or Jewish, because this certainly could be an embrace of nihilism, or it could be moving towards that and not having a fear of it. And I want my interpretation here is he's against this idea of, looking at death and having an afterlife. Maybe he sees that as a cop-out rather than just going to death and embracing the potential that there could be nothing after, and avoiding a fear of that. So I would go with that theme of he's not this carpe diem type. Rather, he's saying there could very well be nothing, and move into that.
Thank you, Pamela. David?
Yeah, thanks for that, guys. I don't know if David S is with us. I'm pretty certain he's not, but if David S was with us, he'd be jumping up and down. Because I think he said at least a couple of times that when we're and understand, Isabel, the mystery part of it is a very big part of what I'm interested in. But just looking at the actual text here, obviously he doesn't use the word mystery, but he does talk about, he sets the ground here by talking about state of mind and mood. So the most that he does in talking about a mood is at the bottom of the page when he's talking about brooding over death, not fully taking away from its character as a possibility. And in such brooding, we weaken it by calculating how we are to have it at our disposal as something possible. It is to show as little as possible of its possibility. And then he talks about the flip side of that. And I guess what I'm picking up here from the mood, Heidegger's own mood in writing this is, I think he would resist the notion of mystery, but at the same time, there's a stance being taken here on the openness and the willingness to pursue better understanding on the part of Heidegger. Just I don't know if that's not much of a resistance on my part, but maybe more of a caveat, I guess. Anyway.
Okay, anticipation. So I've moved on to Macquarie 306, the German 262, second paragraph. But being towards this possibility, as being towards death, is so to comport ourselves towards death, that in this being and for it, death reveals itself as a possibility. Our terminology for such being towards this possibility is anticipation of this possibility. But in this way of behaving, does there not lurk a coming close to the possible? And when one is close to the possible, does not its actualization emerge? In this kind of coming close, however, one does not tend towards concernfully making available something actual, but as one comes closer understandingly, the possibility of the possible just becomes greater. The closest closeness which one may have in being towards death as a possibility is as far as possible from anything actual. I want to keep on reading. The more unveiledly this possibility gets understood, the more purely does the understanding penetrate into it as the possibility of the impossibility of any existence at all. Death as possibility gives Dasein nothing to be actualized, nothing which Dasein as actual could itself be. It is the possibility of the impossibility of every way of comporting oneself towards anything, of every way of existing. In the anticipation of this possibility, it becomes greater and greater. That is to say, the possibility reveals itself to be such that it knows no measure at all, no more or less, but signifies the possibility of the measureless impossibility of existence. In accordance with its essence, this possibility offers no support for becoming intent on something, picturing to oneself the actuality which is possible, and so forgetting its possibility. Being towards that as anticipation of possibility is what first makes this possibility possible and sets it free as possibility. So the last little part there, being towards that as anticipation of possibilities, what first makes this possibility possible and sets itself free and sets it free as possibility. That part was a little tricky, but I think, this is where I was getting what I was responding to Jerry. It seems like he doesn't want, Heidegger doesn't want us to have a measured possibility. Because he says here, it's nothing to be actualized, nothing which Dasein is actual could itself be. It is a possibility of the impossibility of every way of comporting oneself towards anything, of every way of existing. This just makes me think that this is the thinker. This is like Heraclitus in the Temple of Artemis. I don't know if he's saying this is what authentic being, authentic Dasein is, or this is what authentic being towards death is. But he's saying that you're comporting yourself towards everything, towards every way of existing. And I think what that looks like is it looks like it looks like now that this kind of possibility is not that I already speak 4 languages, so it's possible for me to learn a 5th one. I already play 5 sports. It's possible for me to learn how to golf. I think that I don't know if he's saying it's the authentic one or what this is, but it seems very much like he's talking about capital P possible and like that's it. You don't move from that. Once you get to that place, you don't move and make a decision about something. You don't say, I'm going to change my life and become a teacher or a surfer or a government official. I don't think that's, I don't know if he's saying that's not authentic. That's the end of my ramble. I'm not really sure what this is talking about, but I feel it's very important. Yeah, oh, hey, Jason.
I'm sorry to join late, but yeah, but you just talk about the thing, the possibility of impossibility. But my opinion is, I think he's talking about we have a possibility to do anything we want, even face the so-called impossibility. For example, like the death. That's my feeling. I'm not sure it's correct or not, but that's the reading. And then he tried to lead later. Well, he didn't do that, but Sartre will do it. He's talking about the freedom because we have the possibility. That's just my reading. I'm not saying I'm correct, but I'm just saying that's my thinking. Yeah.
And I guess what I'm kind of pushing is I think, I don't know, is like a freedom to choose, but not choosing. I think that's the possibility. I think that's what he's saying here. To be in kind of the light of every way of existing. Lighten, I think that's how you say it. Lighten?
Yeah, Leighton. I'll just draw a different spin of, I'm just imagining Heidegger himself, you know, as he's writing, he goes for a walk in the forest where he's researching, and I'm just having a thought of how, you know, Dasein is so, you know, human, like his indifference to the forest where the trees are all standing still, you know, and how he is walking through possibilities through the forest of that there's just continually, you know, measureless. That's where I just get that measureless impossibility of possibilities that you can go any which way in being lost into the forest. But I don't know. It's just a thought. I see Phil's shaking his head, so probably wrong.
I'm not shaking my head. I'm just sort of thinking.
Oh, thanks, Phil. Thanks.
Yeah.
Nick. You have to unmute yourself, Nick. Nick, unmute yourself.
Sorry, it's like I'm new to this. So here I think he underscores the difference here through anticipation, how different this being towards a possibility, how being towards death is so different from just the previous being towards possibility, where in that case, one does want to actualize, but in the actualization, it is for a purpose of in order to be something. So here in this case, we don't really want to actualize for sure. That is not the intention of being towards death. That is not our goal. The goal is not to die. So, but anticipation is a quality that brings us closer to that possibility, that gets us, because of its nature, it actually puts us in that possibility, that frame of possibility of being towards death. And he will probably break this up into more detail. But just reading through on the next paragraph on German 263, anticipation turns out to be the possibility of understanding one's own most and uttermost potentiality for being. That is to say, the possibility of authentic existence. The ontological constitution of such existence must be made visible by setting forth the concrete structure of anticipation of death. and he's going to go through the concrete. But this is the thing that brings us to authentic existence, this realization of the possibility of one's death, of being towards death. And this is the key to becoming authentic, because that anticipation, again, I'm reading a little bit forward, anticipation reveals to Dasein its lostness in the they self. So by doing this, we reveal to ourselves how we are living in the they self. It brings it face to face with the possibility of being itself, primarily unsupported by concernful solicitude, but of being itself rather in an impassioned freedom towards that, a freedom which has been released from the illusions of the day, in which is practical, certain of itself, and anxious. So this is kind of like his introduction to how it is that we will become authentic, through this anticipation.
Thank you, Nick. Let's go to Phil and Kelsey, and if you could try, we're a little bit over, but if you can try to keep it short, I want to give you all a chance to say something.
Yeah, I mean, in this, he's coming dangerously close to giving up, but I don't think it is that. I think it just further complicates this issue. Once again, so many of my thinking goes back to art. This reminds me so much of Hans Hofmann and the concept of solving the paradox that in life is the push-pull. In other words, the tensional relationship between approach and avoidance. This is actually the dynamic of life itself, to bring that contradiction or that contrariness into full attention for view. Because it's the push-pull, at least in painting, that creates a kind of energetic dynamism that is posited onto the canvas that give you the living moment of creation. I think the push-pull is not like, oh, let's go this way or avoid that way or whatever, but actually that tension is what brings it the moment of existence itself. I think it's a very deep and complex move, because that actually comes close to what I'm saying about the borderline. The borderline is where you have to kind of tread back and forth to walk the tightrope of the push-pull, because you don't want to, make the mistake of giving up, but you don't want to make the mistake of falling off. I think that is actually the energism that drives existence itself. So I don't think he's giving up. I think it's actually bringing a complex dynamic dimension in the energism of existence.
Thank you, Phil. Kelsey, last comment.
Okay, and I think what I was about to say picks up on a little bit of what Phil is saying too. And the phrase that I think is really catchy here to me is that the more purely does understanding penetrate to it as the possibility of the impossibility of existence in general. So I go to this notion that seems to be coming up in Heidegger, and that is the cycle that we're in of creating creating a bond with the world that we understand, and then interpreting that understanding into more world. And so we project the world, and therefore with the ceasing of Dasein, we have to understand that the world that we inhabit, everything that you see, everything that you're in touch with, everything that you can contact or hold, also dies. You live, I think what he's saying, you live in a world that has the potential to cease existing when you stop projecting it into existence. And so thinking back, your great-grandfather lived in a world that no longer exists. And the world that you fell into maybe picked up on something that was handed down to you, and now you are projecting a world which you will end, and that world will enter into a vanishing point at this horizon of death that we know is out there. And if you stay in the circle, that is an authentic way of being. But when you try to get out of the circle and see the whole thing from the outside, then you're no longer in the authentic cycle of being. You're no longer aware that you are indeed the author of this world that exists.
Thank you, Kelsey. So very interesting reading this time. I'll see you all in 2 weeks, and we will continue with authenticity. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good stuff, guys.